Okay, so now we have another question from Christopher H. Christopher H. asked, when purchasing a pre-owned watch, how important is it that the dial and other important parts be original to the watch? Okay, so he says, this is obviously more important from a collectability standpoint for vintage pieces, but also important for watches less than 20 to 25 years old. Is that the case? He asks. Well, I would say this is important because he asks, finally, how would I know that a dial has been changed? I would say consider this. Define what a new or newer dial is, and then define replacement. Okay, I think we can all agree, regardless of whether a watch is brand new and having damage repaired with a new dial or vintage, you must replace with factory. So let that be the first thing to keep in mind. Second, it's important to remember that new dials are principally a problem when they're factory supplied and fully documented, when they appear on vintage watches. For instance, when there's something about the dial, whether it's tritium lume, radium lume, an ink that can't be recreated, a hand painting style that can't be recreated, signage for tritium and radium, or specific hand designs. This is what you need to remember. When something vintage can't be recreated exactly, even if it's a patina that's common, for instance, mid-1960s Speedmasters and tropical dials, or late 1980s gloss-style Rolexes and crazing cracks. If it's a distinctive patina that can't be recreated but is expected, losing the dial is going to be disastrous. That said, even with something like vintage Rolex, there are several levels of replacement. A redial done by an amateur, forget it. Watch is close to useless. A factory service dial, however, could come on several levels. Over the years, for instance, take that red Sea Dweller. Guys, bring back up the picture of the Sea Dweller, the dive watch we just had. There have been several different red Sea Dweller service dials over the years. The first ones actually featured tritium signage at 6 o'clock next to Swiss, but they featured Luminova paint. The more recent ones feature the red script and the period fonts and indices, but they don't feature the tritium signage. So there are different levels of replacement dial, where some are closer to the original, others are less close to the original, but above all, they're factory. Original is still best. Factory replacement is better. Amateur is disqualifying. Now here's the thing, outside the realm of vintage, what if we're talking about a watch built in the last 20 years? Something, I would say, here's my example. My Master Ultra Thin 34. So here's my example of a new watch, relatively speaking, made in the 2000s, that got a new factory dial, and this both shows you how you can tell the dial has been replaced and should be a useful commentary on the importance of new dials or original dials on a recent watch. I bought this watch from Japan knowing that the dial was rough, that there was evidence of moisture intrusion on the dial and the movement due to rarity and good pricing. I bought the watch for $3,000. I then sent it to JLC with instructions, restore watch. And what I received was restoration of all the individual components of the watch, the bridges, the train wheels, as well as replacement of the dial, which was water damaged. It was replaced with an exact duplicate. Not similar, not a service replacement dial, the exact same dial. So the watch is now all JLC, factory, and immaculate. And even better, they won't do that kind of work. No factory will, without doing a full movement service, as well as restoration of case integrity and water resistance. So I now have a watch that's factory spec with a fully documented service and documentation that the dial is factory, as well as the hands, which were also replaced. That's fine. That's just a matter of making a recent watch whole again. This is not a collectible watch, a vintage watch, and it's not a watch whose different sub-permutations are defined by subtle changes in dial. They were the same throughout. So that's how you'll know if a dial's been changed. It's either a recognizable factory replacement, as on the older Rolex, a forgery done by an amateur, or it's a new watch with a receipt or an invoice from the factory showing a dial replacement. Jason, do you have any thoughts on that? The impact of a new dial on a modern watch?
I think you nailed, unless it's something, like you just said, unless it's something that specifically changes the value of the watch in a vintage piece, there's really no way around getting a new dial. I mean, what are you're just going to have a cracked dial. You're going to have a piece that's not complete. So sending it in, having it done the right way is the most important thing.
I think so too, and I think the red line on a vintage watch is integrity. If the dial is decomposing, like there's arrested decay. That's the ruins of ancient Rome. That's what you see when you go to Italy. They're not going to let you into the Colosseum if pieces are falling off and the thing's in danger of collapse. And the same is true of your watch. If the dial's flaking, if the dial feet are corroding and no longer able to secure the dial within the movement, if there's evidence of material from the decomposing dial getting into the movement, if radium has come loose, all of the above mean something's going to have to be done, and it's probably a dial replacement or dial reconditioning. So that's the red line. At the point it becomes a decomposing dial, or it's going to endanger the movement or the integrity of the watch, you've got to do something about the dial, and Rolex will replace it as best as possible with a service replacement. So will Omega, so will Breitling. They all have their individual way of doing it. Best case scenario, always restore a watch with the factory by first getting an estimate and asking if a restoration service rather than a conventional service is available.